All right. So you guys really wanted to hear more about Curtis Don Brown, and I can see why this case is, well, it's got some twists and turns to say the least. It really takes us into some pretty dark places, but also shows how justice and technology sometimes, well, they sometimes work together in ways you might not expect. Curtis Don Brown, he's an American serial killer, also a rapist, convicted of murdering 3 women down in Texas, but that's not even the whole story. Investigators think he might be involved in something like 18 murders.
Yeah.
18.
Wow, 18 murders. I mean, that's what makes these cases so fascinating, but also terrifying, right?
Hmm?
How can someone commit so many awful acts and potentially go undetected for so long?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let's try and unpack what we know about Brown, starting with his early life. He was born in 1958, and then at just 13 years old, he went through something truly horrific, a house fire that killed both of his younger siblings and badly injured his mother. I mean, what kind of impact does that have on a 13-year-old?
Oh, it's huge. That kind of trauma, that early in life, it can really mess with your development, emotionally, psychologically. It can lead to all sorts of problems, anger, isolation, difficulty forming healthy attachments. Now, obviously, childhood trauma doesn't automatically turn someone into a criminal, but it can offer some insight into, well, into how a criminal mind might develop.
So we're not saying it's a direct cause, but we can't just ignore it either, right? All right, let's fast forward to 1986. Brown gets arrested for murdering 51-year-old Jewel Woods in Fort Worth, Texas. Anything about this crime stand out to you?
The Woods, she was a former nurse, and she was attacked right outside her own home, raped, and then bludgeoned to death. The level of violence in this case, it was striking. Really pointed towards some deep-seated rage, maybe a need for control, something like that.
And get this, the police weren't even looking for Brown when they arrested him.
Talk about bad luck, huh?
Yeah, they were actually in the area for something completely unrelated when they saw Brown running away from the scene.
He'd run almost a mile, completely out of breath when they finally caught him. And, to make matters worse, they found Woods' purse on him.
Not exactly a master criminal. So, with all that evidence against him, Brown's convicted in '89, sentenced to life in prison. You'd think that's the end of it, right? Case closed. Not even close. This is where the story takes a turn and DNA technology really comes into play.
Absolutely. We're talking 2005 now. DNA technology has come a long way, and they're starting to require DNA samples from prisoners. So they get Brown's DNA, put it into the system, and guess what?
What?
It matches evidence from 2 unsolved murders from way back in 1985. 29-year-old Therese Gregory and 18-year-old Sharon Killsback.
2 cold cases, just like that, cracked wide open because of a DNA swab. It really makes you think, how many more cases are out there just waiting for this kind of breakthrough?
It's amazing, isn't it, the power of science to bring justice, finally, after all these years. And it's also a reminder of how limited we were before these advancements.
Exactly. So who were Therese Gregory and Sharon Killsback? What can you tell us about them and how they died?
Well, Sharon Killsback, her body was found in a storm drain 8 days after she went missing. There was a rope around her neck, so strangulation probably. Therese Gregory, her body was found later in the Trinity River, actually. She was naked, and there was evidence she'd been both raped and shot. It's important to remember, these were real people, daughters, sisters, friends. Their lives were cut short brutally, and their families were left with nothing but pain and unanswered questions.
It's heartbreaking to think about what their loved ones went through for years with no answers. And then suddenly, out of the blue, this DNA match appears, linking their cases to Curtis Don Brown, a guy already serving life for another murder. It's hard to grasp the ripple effect of these crimes, how they touch so many lives in such awful ways.
Absolutely. The brutality, the fact that he was already in prison for murder, it sent shockwaves through the community, through law enforcement. They started looking back at Brown's past, trying to connect him to other unsolved cases.
And that's when things get even darker, right? Because they started to suspect that Brown could be responsible for many more murders, going all the way back to 1984. That's where those chilling numbers come from. Some investigators think he could have killed up to 18 people.
It's a terrifying thought. And it raises so many questions like, how do you even begin to unravel a case like that? How do you connect all these seemingly random crimes, especially when you're dealing with cold cases that go back years, decades even?
That's what we'll try to figure out as we continue this deep dive. Stick with us, because this story, it's far from over. Okay, so we left off with investigators facing this massive task, right? Trying to link Curtis Don Brown to all these unsolved murders, potentially going all the way back to 1984. I mean, it's like trying to put together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing, and some are from a completely different puzzle. How do they even start to make sense of all that?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, but Investigators have developed, certain techniques over the years, ways to approach these really complex cases. They start by looking for, well, any kind of common threads, any patterns that might connect these crimes.
Right, patterns. But what kind of patterns? What are they actually looking for?
So one of the most important things is victimology. They look really closely at the victims' backgrounds, trying to find any similarities, their age, what they did for work, their social habits, anything that might give a clue about why they were targeted.
So with Brown, all his confirmed victims were women, but their ages were all over the place. Does that tell us anything?
It might. It suggests that age maybe wasn't the most important factor for him. Maybe he was drawn to vulnerability, or maybe he just saw an opportunity. Who knows? It's a bit like trying to crack a code, figuring out what the killer was thinking.
And what about where the crimes happened? I mean, we know Brown's victims were found in different places, a storm drain, the Trinity River. How does that factor into the investigation?
Well, that's where geographic profiling comes in. They look at the locations of the crimes, see if there are any patterns there. Do the locations form a cluster? Or maybe there's a central point, an anchor, where the victim's taken from one place and then dumped somewhere else. All these things can give valuable clues.
So it's like you're mapping out the killer's movements, right? Trying to see where they might be operating, where they feel comfortable.
Exactly. And that can help narrow down the search area, maybe even point to suspects who have a connection to those places.
You also mentioned something called modus operandi, or MO. What is that, and how does it help?
The MO, that's basically the killer's style, their preferred methods, how they go about committing their crimes.
Got it.
With Brown, we see some variations in his MO, strangulation, bludgeoning, even shooting.
Hmm. That's interesting. I would have thought a consistent MO would make it easier to link the crimes, wouldn't it?
You'd think so, but actually, a lot of serial killers, they change things up over time. Maybe they get more confident or they're trying to avoid getting caught. It makes things tougher for investigators, that's for sure.
It's like they're learning as they go, trying to stay one step ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's often the case.
But we can't forget about forensic evidence, especially DNA. I mean, in Brown's case, that's what cracked the whole thing open.
Absolutely. DNA has been a game changer in criminal justice. It can identify the bad guys, clear innocent people, and solve cold cases that we thought would never be solved.
Well, what about cases where there's no DNA match? Like, what if the evidence is too old or wasn't collected properly?
Then it gets a lot trickier. They have to rely on old school methods, talking to witnesses, piecing together timelines, looking for any little connection.
Sounds like a lot of guesswork.
It can be, but sometimes even a hunch can lead to a breakthrough.
So how do they even decide which cases to focus on when they're dealing with so little information?
They usually start with cases that share the most similarities. Maybe the victims fit a similar profile, or the crimes happen close together geographically, anything that hints at a possible connection. They're basically trying to build a profile of the killer, understand how they think, what drives them.
It's like you're trying to get inside their head, understand what makes them tick, but that can't be easy, especially with someone like Brown. I mean, his crimes seem so random, so chaotic.
It's definitely one of the hardest parts of these investigations, trying to build a psychological profile from, well, basically scraps of information, like piecing together a puzzle. But some of the pieces are missing, and you're never quite sure what the full picture looks like.
And in this case, it's even trickier because Brown was already locked up when those DNA matches came back. He wasn't out there committing new crimes, so investigators had to rely on old case files, some going back years. That must have been a huge obstacle.
Oh, absolutely. Cold cases, they always present unique challenges. Witnesses move away, memories fade, evidence gets lost or deteriorates. And when you're dealing with a potential serial killer, every day that passes, the trail gets colder.
It's a race against time, and sometimes time wins. But what about the victims, the ones we don't know about? I mean, we know Brown killed at least 3 women, but there could be many more. What happens to those cases? The ones where there's no DNA match, no solid evidence? Do they just stay open forever? What about their families? Are they just left wondering?
It's a sad truth, but a lot of cases, they never get solved. And that lack of closure, it can be devastating for the families. But even without a direct link to Brown, investigators, they keep looking. They review those unsolved cases, searching for anything that might connect to him, to his MO, to the types of victims he targeted.
So even though Brown's behind bars, the investigation, in a way, it never really ends.
That's right. There's always a chance that new evidence will turn up, a witness will come forward, or a cold case will suddenly break open.
And that's why it's so important to keep these stories alive, right? to remind people that these victims deserve justice, and to encourage anyone who might have information, even a small detail, to come forward.
Exactly. Sometimes the smallest thing can make all the difference.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Curtis Dawn Brown case, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember? What's the big picture here?
Well, this case, it really shows us how powerful DNA technology can be. It can solve crimes, bring justice to victims, and give their families some peace. But it also shows how difficult it is to catch a serial killer, especially when you're dealing with cold cases. And most importantly, I think, it reminds us to never forget the victims. Their lives mattered, and they deserve justice.
It's a dark story, for sure, but there's also hope. The dedication of the investigators, the advancements in science, and the strength of the human spirit to keep fighting, even in the face of tragedy.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are people working to make things right, to bring closure, and to stop these horrible things from happening again.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. We hope this deep dive gave you a better understanding of this case and the bigger issues it brings up. If you want to learn more about Curtis Dawn Brown or about criminal justice and forensics, there are tons of resources out there. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and never stop searching for the truth.